And welcome back to another episode of Master's Class. We're going to get into the ideas of the Enlightenment and why it matters. Well, basically, the Enlightenment was just a continuation of the age of reason, the scientific revolution. So we see this word being tossed around a lot, reason. This is one of the favorite words of the intellectuals of this era, particularly of the scientific revolution of the 16 and 1700s. But as we get further into the 1700s and the latter half, we start to shift. It's not just the scientific revolution anymore. Now it's the age of reason, the Enlightenment. And we're going to start to see a more philosophical approach to the woes of mankind, to the miseries of mankind. We're going to start to see that this idea of applying reason, the scientific method, logic, to figure out how the natural world around us works, maybe we can apply a similar method to how we interact with one another. So we're going to start to see an era marked by reason, by natural law, with hope, and with progress, all to make for a better society, right? We want to progress towards a better society. So the Enlightenment really is like a force for reform. And we're going to see a lot of reform movements as we start to see, it might feel cold at times, but I assure you there's plenty of emotion or reason with these philosophs, as the French would say, or the philosophers. So we're going to start to see Enlightenment thinkers, or the philosophs, as most of them are French. That's where we use the French term. But they're scattering mostly from middle class and aristocratic families, but they do come from all walks of life. And they're going to re-examine various aspects from how we govern ourselves, how we dispense justice, how do we worship in the role of religion in not just a singular individual's life, but in society as a whole. And of course, women's rights and just general individual idea of freedom. All of these things will be tackled. And this is going to be a huge influence, mostly in the Western world, but it's going to spill out worldwide as well, as these ideas are championed and carried forth. And we're going to see some of the great thinkers, or the philosophs. So we can see a chart right here we have on the right, the Baron De Montesquieu, we have Voltaire, Denis Diderot, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all of whom contribute heavily and greatly influence the founding fathers of this country in the United States of America. And we're going to see that with some of their greatest hits, The Spirit of Laws from Montesquieu, Treatise on Toleration, and Candide. Voltaire has so many. They all do, it's worth mentioning. They all have many papers they've written, books, treatises, articles, novels. But we're just talking about some of the greatest hits and the ones that they're really best known for. The Encyclopedia for Denis Diderot, a classic work, a great work, if you will. We'll talk more about that. And Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of the Inequality of Mankind, and of course his big one, The Social Contract. This is defining what it means to have an agreement with a governing body and what the people actually get out of that, and what, of course, they have to give up as well. So when we talk about these philosophs and other Enlightenment philosophers who are spreading an age of reason, shedding a light of logic and reason across mankind to promote sort of a social revolution, government revolution. And I don't mean violent necessarily when I say revolution. I mean just a critical way of how human beings treat one another and operate in society. And even the idea of what society could be. They all get major inspiration from two individuals primarily. The first, we have Jean-Jacques, all right, an Englishman, along with Isaac Newton, also an Englishman. So we start with Jean-Jacques. In his essay concerning human understanding, Jean-Jacques, a lot like these other philosophs and philosophers, he's published heavily, and he has many great works that have influenced ideas of how society should operate, but it's this one that really sort of kickstarts the imagination of the philosopher. So he argues that everyone is basically born tabula rasa. It's Latin not for blank mind, actually means blank slate, but it loosely translates to the same thing. But the idea is that people are a blank slate when they're born. You're not born, so he rejects the idea of like divine right of kings and all that, clearly. He says that basically we're molded by the experiences that come through our senses, right? We're informed by the stimuli, by the surrounding world around us as we incorporate our five senses, right? So that might mean then that if we put a child who would normally be born in condition of, say, slavery, and a child who would normally be born to become a king, and if we could reverse their roles, right? If we could just switch places, then really that would prove that one child is not destined to be a slave and one child is not destined to be a king after all. That we really are products of our upbringing, of our environment, and how our senses help us shape and make sense of the surrounding world, right? So what he's trying to drive at here is that if we could just simply improve, right, our environment, if we could change what people are exposed to by giving them what he calls the right influences, then they could be changed to create a new, better society. People might not be so dang miserable. Maybe we could drastically improve an individual's life and therefore society as a whole by just coming to certain conclusions. Conclusions such as, everybody has certain natural inalienable rights. We are born free, and so we should remain free. Therefore, we should not operate with institutions such as slavery. We should abolish institutions like that. So that's going to be an idea that's going to be championed. We'll see a little bit more about that near the end of the lesson. And then you have Isaac Newton. So we have John Locke concerned about who we are, how we treat one another, how we operate, society in general, right? Isaac Newton is the more meta of the two. So we talk about him in the scientific revolution. So what Isaac Newton is talking about is that the world is a great machine, right? His understandings, his laws, his Newtonian laws, right? His laws on gravity, on physics, the work he puts out, the Principia de Mathematica, as he basically lays out ideas of gravity, inertia, friction, physics, how the world, calculus, how the world actually operates and the math to prove it. And not just our planet, but our planet's place within the cosmos, the galaxy, the universe. Once we have this understanding, we could perhaps apply this idea that if we're trying to understand the sort of clockwork mechanism that is the universe, maybe we could apply the same rationale, the same reason, the same scientific method towards natural laws beyond our physical world. Maybe we could discover the natural laws that actually govern human society itself. And if we can do this, then all institutions would then have to follow these natural laws, because logically it would make sense to do so, because it would result in the most ideal society. So we're taking the scientific method, we're taking reason, we're taking logic, we're taking emotion for the most part out of play. We're taking superstition out of play as best we can. And we're applying just cold, hard rationale with data, facts, math, irrefutable facts, right? So that means we have to turn our attention to some of the philosophs. So we see these philosophers, predominantly the French philosophs, really taking the works of John Locke And of course, we're taking not just John Locke, but we're taking Isaac Newton, and even another French philosopher, mathematician, scientist, in the form of René Descartes, who I talked about during the scientific revolution. I think, therefore I am. And they're going to move things forward. So we see, where do they draw their inspiration from? But now we got to see who are these individuals that are inspired. Where they're writers, they're professors, they're journalists, they're economists. But all of them are essentially social reformers. Yes, they chiefly come from the nobility, from the aristocratic class. They are, or middle class. They are predominantly well-read. They are not typically of the working class, but some are. But mostly they come from, the well-to-do, the well-read, the well-educated. And they are going to take lessons from the scientific revolutionaries, from other philosophers that have come before them, and they're going to shape new ideas, and they're going to put it out there for other people to teach, to read, to learn from. Because, interestingly enough, when we get into the second half of the 1700s, in the 18th century that is, we're seeing a far more literate society. Thank you, printing press. Only took a couple hundred years since your innovation from Johann Gutenberg, but we've gotten there. People are just far more literate as a whole, as a society, than they ever have been, particularly in European culture and society. So I have mentioned that most of them come from these classes, but all of them are social reformers. They all see, personally, some aspect of society that they think is whack. It's out of line. Something is wrong with it. It doesn't make sense. It seems to contribute more to misery by persecuting others. So we need to think about rationalizing. Does that system in place make sense? Does this superstitious belief actually make sense? Or does it seem to be holding us as human beings back from some sort of progress? Well, we're going to start to see some of those ideas play out. So, in the spirit of rational criticism, we're going to apply reason to aspects including religion. We're going to apply it to politics. And we're going to see that in this landscape, these intellectual elites, these philosophers, predominantly will be of the big four: Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau. And it is worth noting that when one is born and one is able to study and commit a work, commit their mind to work and produce a body of work, a future philosopher is going to read that work and apply it to their own works. So they all are greatly influenced by one another. And we're going to see that with this guy right here, the Baron De Montesquieu. He certainly comes from one of the great aristocratic families of French society. He is one of the elite society. He is very well read. So he is a French noble. In addition to the many works he produces, the big one is The Spirit of Laws in 1748. Right in the middle, dang near right in the middle of the century. And it's going to lead to some real drastic thinking and changes of how we view social and political relationships of human beings and what laws we say are natural and how we choose to govern ourselves. And not just how we choose to govern ourselves, but how we choose to even set up government. So Montesquieu, being French, looks at, at the time, England's government. And he notes 3 branches. And this is going to sound real familiar, I'm sure. So he notes 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, right? So for England, it was the monarch. For the legislative, right, the lawmaking body, it was Parliament. And for the judicial, it was the courts of law. Well, guess what we have? Clearly, the founding fathers of our country, the U.S., were heavily influenced by Montesquieu because we have 3 branches of government. We have the executive, right, the president in our case, the legislative, Congress, which is Congress and the Senate, And then we have the judicial, we have the Supreme Court and, of course, all the other lower courts below it. So the government functions through a separation of powers. He believes that when you have these three branches of government, they can limit and control one another in a system of checks and balances. One body of government simply cannot exceed in power and hold absolute power, because the other two branches can check that power. They can check any corruption or abuse of power. So by preventing any one person or group from gaining too much power, this system therefore provides the best and greatest access for human beings for freedom and security for the state. That's what the Baron De Montesquieu argues. So we have a system of checks and balances through separation of powers. This is going to be his biggest contribution to the age of enlightenment, this age of reason here. And obviously it heavily influences American philosophers and the democratic republican principles of our Constitution of the United States. Next up, we have the face, all right? If Montesquieu is the big brain, and they're all big brains, no doubt, Voltaire is the face of the Enlightenment. There's no question about it. He is the most well-known. He's the most socially active. He's a real intellectual and cultural and social revolutionary. He lands himself in prison. He actually lands himself in the worst prison in French society, the Bastille. Before the French Revolution, the Bastille was basically where the King of France put the enemies of state, as he would put it. And if you landed in the Bastille, it was a pretty bad time. You were basically there for treason. You've challenged the king for some reason. But, not everybody who was in the Bastille was there because they angered or upset the king. Just, a good portion of them. And it was not a place you wanted to be, because French prisons in the 1700s were pretty bad stuff. So he's there as an agitator. Voltaire, he notes the inadequacies of society, you might put it. And he's very cognizant of these inadequacies because he, and this is going to sound odd, he doesn't grow up poor or anything like that. He doesn't grow up working class even. He comes from a prosperous Parisian middle class family. He's on the upper scale of things. And it's because of this that he's able to look at, a world through the haves and the have-nots and why that is. Why should I be born in such a state of privilege when so many others are not? I can read, I can write. What good are those talents and abilities if I can't bring about reform, if I can't change the world around me for the betterment of most, if not all? So Voltaire, he looks at institutions of power and of corruption. And his biggest foe is the Catholic Church. He basically takes on Christianity, but really, because Catholicism is so heavily influential in French society, he mostly challenges the Catholic Church. He's very much an enemy of religious superstition. There's a famous advocacy project he was working on, a man by the name of Calais, and basically this man is sent to prison to be executed, tortured, hideously tortured, waterboarded, and he's going to have all his bones broken while he's being waterboarded. He dies, the man he's trying to save, unfortunately. And the reason why he's advocating for this guy, he's accused of murdering his son for wanting to convert to Catholicism, which is not true. That's a lie. The man's son committed suicide over gambling debts. So Voltaire is trying to spread awareness of this situation, but unfortunately he's unable to save this man. And this is one of the big reasons why he's so critical of the Catholic Church. They have all this power and this authority. They are able to essentially instigate and initiate this man having been arrested and then torturing the daylights out of him. I mean, being waterboarded is pretty sadistic stuff. And then having your bones, all your bones in your body, broken as well, to confess to murdering your son, which is not true. Pretty messed up stuff. So he notes it's because of this religious intoleration that this man was, unnecessarily tortured and then executed. So he's really not a fan of the church. He's not a fan of institutions of immense, unchecked power. So he fights against religious intolerance in France. So Voltaire, as a result of this, is going to champion the idea of what's known as Deism. All right, this is a new idea of how to view religion through reason and natural law. So this is mostly comes from the works of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton put out that God is like a clockmaker. He created a clockwork mechanism, the universe, and we can understand how that mechanism operates by understanding, Newtonian physics predominantly. Read my book, Newton would say, if you can figure it out. So it sort of sets in motion this idea that God, as a clockmaker, has already set up the universe. It operates, and it operates independently of this God. And therefore, it runs without his interference and according to its own natural laws, which is up to us to figure out. So to these deists, God is simply a mechanic who's already done his job. He's created the universe. And so most deists, they think that God is basically just completely hands-off. He's laissez-faire, which I'm going to bring up that term again when we get to Adam Smith in a moment. But the idea here is that God is either dead, which is the more grim view that some deists, including our founding fathers, adopted, or God has simply just decided, you know what, I've done my job, the clock is working just fine, and it is up to human beings to figure things out based on my design, on their own accord. And so this is why, to Voltaire, it was so despicable that human beings should use something like religion as a justification for executing and torturing another person, because certainly God wouldn't want that, it seems. It's up to us to figure out his mechanism, his works. So we really can't use, if we want to think about it rationally and logically, religion as an excuse, because anybody could just say anything if they don't understand the science and the math about how this world that this God has created. So he says that we have to understand those natural laws and apply them to our own societies so we can avoid situations where we're persecuting and executing and torturing other people based on religion. So this is where the philosophers are really starting to have a field day. And this, how do we spread this knowledge though? How do we spread this understanding? Well, we can look to Denis Diderot. So Diderot is going to be essential, absolutely essential, for spreading the ideas of enlightenment. So he goes to the University of Paris. His dad wants him to pursue a career in law or the church, but Diderot wants neither. He is a writer. He's a thinker. And he wants to really spread the idea of where knowledge comes from, and he wants to spread challenging new ideas. So he takes on a real tough enterprise. I mean, this is, we have to think of the encyclopedia now. It just seems so blasé to us. It seems so easy to access, but we have to really think about the hard work that would have gone in to crafting an encyclopedia. 28 volumes that cover all manner of subject matter. I mean, when you look into the encyclopedia today, I mean, just about anything that you want to know can be found right there. There are articles that inform us about information on just about any given subject matter, but that had to come from somewhere. And it has to be argued from a place of absolute fact, logic, and reason. It can't be opinionated. And if it is opinionated, it has to be backed up by, again, reason, logic, facts. So he is going to have drawings, meticulous drawings of mechanical works, such as the printing press, which is, by the way, a great way of how the encyclopedia is going to be produced, manufactured, and spread for the public. The idea here is to challenge the general way of thinking. So when somebody goes to the letter A, or the letter M, they see machine. Well, what is a machine? Well, now we have this very non-emotional, very rational, some might even say cold text about what a machine actually is. Some of the machines that you can find that start with this letter go to this page in the encyclopedia, or go to this volume in the encyclopedia. But you'll find machines, animals, places, countries, concepts. And he introduces tons of original articles himself within the encyclopedia. He publishes tremendously in the encyclopedia in this period between 1751 and 1772. He writes an article on blindness. So what is blindness? What does it come from? Well, he certainly dismisses the idea that it's a superstitious thing. It's certainly not a curse that happens to a person. So in the Bible, there is a chapter, a verse, where a man is struck with blindness for having viewed something that he shouldn't have seen. I'm not going to get into that. But this idea was that it's not a curse, So he writes an article about what blindness actually is, what we know about it scientifically through reason. We can prove it, and then he even suggests a writing system for the blind, and this is actually going to lead to the creation of Braille. He introduces a concept that somebody else is going to champion because they had read this article on blindness from his encyclopedia. This categorization of all things. Pretty impressive work, a stunning work. And because of it, it attacks religious superstition. It supports religious toleration. It calls for social, legal, political reforms. As doctors, clergymen, teachers, lawyers, they not only read it, but they start to have a greater understanding of how one can apply reason and rational thought to just about any aspect of the world around them. They start to view things in a very different way. And one of those people that's going to view the world in a very different way is Adam Smith, a Scottish economist. He's a philosopher. He's a professor. He is a political scientist. He's an economist. He is influenced by Newton's methods. He's influenced by a French group known as the physiocrats, who are interested in identifying how natural economic laws govern human society. They start to maintain that if individuals are free to pursue their own economic self-interests, that all society would actually benefit. It's kind of this idea of if you just get your own house in order, do what's right by you, and when you put yourself into a better position, you are then more likely to be positioned to help influence positively other people in society. The state, if you will, the governing body of your geopolitical system that you operate in, should not interrupt the free play of natural economic forces by regulating the economy. The government should essentially be as hands-off or laissez-faire. Let the people do what they want when it comes to the economy. Adam Smith certainly champions this laissez-faire economic policy that these physiocrats are talking about. He fully believes that, yes, people should be free to self-advocate in a merchant and economic system. He believes in a free enterprise system Businesses compete against one another with little oversight or control by the government. He puts this out in his famous work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. This is going to have an enormous impact, not just on the United States, but really just the idea of capitalism, period. This is going to start to begin the shift between the mercantilist system, where people are expected to just hoard wealth, to capitalism, where people acquire wealth, but then they distribute it and spend it on the goods that they need. And naturally, the economy, the market, people, someone will figure out what the needs of society are. They will adjust to it, and they will produce those goods for the betterment of that society, for the betterment of those people. So the state should not interfere in economic matters. Don't inhibit the natural progression of what people desire and what they want, because inevitably it will be for the good of all. But that's not inherently true, and we've seen that. Unfortunately, we have seen that. People, businesses can absolutely produce a product that people might want, but is not good for people. It does not make society better. It produces income, produces money, produces revenue, certainly, taxable income, but does not always inevitably lead to the betterment of society. So Smith does have to make some reconciliation. He does note that there is a chance for abuses, and he does write about that when he writes On Business and Society from the Wealth of Nations. He does note that there can be abuses, that there is a role, and he certainly backtracks it in the later part of his life, where there is a role for government to intercede. And so he talks about that in this aspect right here. He says, government does have a role. It should protect society from invasion, which is the function of the army. The government should defend its citizens from injustice, the function of police. And finally, it should keep up certain public works that private individuals alone could not afford or should not be expected to build on their own, such as roads and canals, things that are necessary for social interaction, for business, for trade. But he does believe in the later part of his life that there should be perhaps some government oversight of certain businesses that acquire too much power and influence. Can we legitimately prove that that business is providing a product or a service that is to the betterment and not the detriment of its people, of the public, of society? But for the most part, he says that we should engage in laissez-faire economics, let the people do as they want, because they will be governed by an invisible hand. The invisible hand of the market, he calls it. That naturally, this invisible hand pushes and guides us to the avenues that we would naturally want to go. The people clamor for, better clothing. They're too cold. Then somebody is going to figure out a method to produce superior articles of clothing that keep us warmer in colder climates, and then the people will naturally want to work towards purchasing or producing those goods. And that fulfills a need and a want and a desire. And lastly, for the great four, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, a tremendous mind, much like the other philosophers, puts out many works. But by the late 1760s, we start to see the new generation of philosophs. They have been inspired by these other philosophers. Society has become increasingly aware of the need for liberty, the condition and plight of women, and they are able to better put out their works because society is a far more literate society. So Rousseau puts out his discourse on the origins of the inequality of mankind and the social contract. So he argues that people have adopted laws and government in order to preserve their private property. And for the most part, this has been increasingly true. But the problem here is that they have become enslaved by government and they needed to regain their freedom. Everywhere man is free, he starts, and everywhere man is in chains. So, people are born free, and yet everywhere man is in chains. He's talking about not just the idea of slavery, which is a big thing that he attacks. He's very much against slavery. But he's also talking about how just even, in government systems that exist, we have allowed ourselves to become oppressed. So he talks about this idea of the social contract. What rights do we actually need to give up for safety and security to be governed justly? So he argues that we have a social contract that's inherent with human beings and any kind of government-based system. So through a social contract, an entire society agrees to be governed by its general will. What do the people generally want? Well, instead of just following our own self-interests, the way, say, Adam Smith might champion with his On the Wealth of Nations and laissez-faire economics, maybe it's better that we are forced to abide by a general will. So this means, of course, if you could ask anybody, we all want to be free, right? We all want to be free. This means nothing less than that they will be forced to be free. Thus, liberty is achieved by being forced to follow what is best for the general will. The general idea of what makes for a better society. What's best for the entire community, not just a segment of that community. So unlike many of the other Enlightenment thinkers, Rousseau believes that emotions, as well as reason, are important in human development. So we can't just have cold, rational, logical thought and reason. This actually steals away from any sort of validation that religion might bring, and therefore what is moral. So we might be completely amoral, and we might have a very scientific, logical, rational society, but we might treat people rather coldly, and this means that there's a new type of slavery that might be initiated, one where the literate control everything, right? The intelligentsia, only the best and the brightest, and they will use their minds, right, to put down and to prevent those who say are born of a working class or in a poor condition to essentially become a new type of slave. So we have to have heart. We have to think and we have to feel. We have to balance emotion, and we have to use emotion to balance our reason and how we choose to view others through a different lens. Those that might be less fortunate than ourselves, those who are actually more privileged than ourselves as well, and to not to demonize them either. So we have to give up certain rights as a society if we expect to be governed and to have order. But we can expect by doing so, giving up these certain privileges perhaps, that we have certain rights, certain natural rights that are enforced by law. That everyone has a right, not just some people, such as, generally speaking, freedom. So, taking some inspiration from this, but also challenging it, we're going to see right here, Mary Wollstonecraft, she's going to write on a vindication of the rights of women, because she notes that Rousseau talks a good game, as do a lot of these other philosophers, but they all seem to come up short when it comes to women's rights. So usually the term men is used when in this idea of natural rights. Seems to apply mostly to just men and not women. And therefore, many of these philosophers who are taking on the light of enlightenment, they seem to stop short when the conversation comes to women, because women have been thus far made to be inferior to men. through social doctrine, through political doctrine, through intellectual doctrine. We have seen this time and time again throughout European history especially. So Mary Wollstonecraft wants to encourage and express to female thinkers and male thinkers both about ways on improving the condition of women. So she wants to advance the strongest statement for women's rights. She's heavily influential in England and the Americas. Many see her as the founder of modern European and American rights for women. She says that basically in her work of vindication of the rights of women, we have to look at, who are the people who are arguing that women must obey men? What institutions are they coming from? And are these institutions superstitious, not based on logic, reason, or fact? Just arbitrary power, such as the power wielded by kings and queens over their subjects, which, if we accept that that is wrong, then we must also accept that the treatment of women, where they are expected to just arbitrarily obey men, would also be wrong as well. So she points out that power of men over women is just as wrong as, say, arbitrary power of a divine right monarch over its subjects is wrong if we subscribe to the ideas of, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that everyone should be born free, or the Baron De Montesquieu, that the best system of government is really a separation of powers through a system of checks and balances. So she argues that women should have equal rights to education, to participating in the economy, and participating in political life and the government as well. Because if you can liberate half the human population and enlighten them, because if women are creatures of reason, as are all human beings, then why should they not be entitled to the same rights as men? Pretty straightforward stuff. So we're also going to see the Enlightenment spread through not just reading and writing, obviously, through the publication of works, but through the salons, particularly this French concept. But we see it happen in coffee houses. You see, this is an era where, the Columbian exchange is thriving, right? So Europe has thousands, literally thousands of new edibles, from vegetables to fruits to meat that they have harvested, that they have planted, that they have cultivated in the Americas and other colonies. And this creates a greater caloric intake. So people are healthier, they're living longer lives, but it's not just the foods that they're eating, it's what they're drinking as well. It used to be in European society, because the water was unsafe, that you would have to, tend to drink more alcoholic beverages, because through the distillation process, through the brewing process, you eliminated harmful parasites. Well, this, of course, leads to a more drunken society that's not able to function as properly. But now, instead of drinking beer, instead of drinking wine, instead of drinking liquor, men and women are more habitually drinking things like tea and coffee. So they're getting more energy. They're more awake as they have more caffeine. And because of this, they're exchanging ideas that they're reading at a rapid rate. And they're discussing these ideas in these gathering places. And it's also here Mary Wollstonecraft would appreciate that women, particularly the wives of very well-to-do elites of society, particularly in French society, would host in their elegant drawing rooms the upper middle class and the middle class and the elites of society to basically just exchange ideas. What are you working on? What are you reading? What are you writing? Talk to these people about what you're working on, what you've read. Let's exchange these ideas. And we're going to find what is superstitious. We're going to separate what is superstitious, what is irrational, to what is rational, what is logical, and what makes sense emotionally to us as well. And so we're going to see an explosive spread of ideas as more people are basically getting caffeinated. They're getting juiced on coffee, and they're getting more tea, they're getting more caffeine in their system, and they're spreading these ideas at a more rapid rate. And after they depart the salon, they would go to their respective sectors of society. So the aristocrat might talk to other nobles and elites of society about these new ideas of how to better society in general. The government official might decide, you know what, this law is actually arbitrary. It doesn't make sense. It needs to be changed. And I'm going to advocate who I need to talk to, maybe these aristocrats, to helping me change this law. And the wealthy middle-class people as well. And those who they interact with in their businesses might be the working class. And now this idea disseminates to the general public and the working class as they interact with these individuals. And so women who hosted these salons are in quite a position to sway political opinion and help spread the ideas of the Enlightenment. And we talked a lot about superstition being tied to religion in the Enlightenment. Well, we're going to see John Wesley. He's an Anglican minister. He's an Englishman. He's basically going to help found the sect of Methodism, all right, the Methodist Church. And he believes he's got the gift of God's grace, right? He's going to assure people of salvation. Well, how does this serve the idea of enlightenment? Doesn't it just seem like more superstition? We've heard this before. Well, the glad tidings he's talking about, that he's going to spread, the salvation of which he's going to preach 2 to 3 times a day, is really about uplifting people. It's spreading not through just pure philosophy or rational thought, but an emotional state that will lead to the abolition of the slave trade. People are going to realize that if they do good works, they're not just making themselves feel better, but they are notably influencing the communities of which they exist in, that they inhabit, and even communities beyond where they live in. And if we can lift everybody up to experience this, the gift of God's grace, that means we need to free people from bondage and servitude. So we're going to start to see real advocacy for the abolition of the slave trade in the early 1800s because of John Wesley's preaching, the foundation of the Methodist Church, and of course this Methodist group that is going to emerge after his death, really championing this idea of the abolition of the slave trade. So this is pretty huge stuff. So we see in both music and art and architecture, Enlightenment ideas spread as well. Quite simply, a new style known as Rococo, which is known more for some of the paintings we've seen. Grace, charm, gentle action. It's going to starkly contrast from the Baroque style that came before it. Still quite lavish, but it spoke more to the pursuit of pleasure, happiness, love, lighter themes, and therefore more accessible. Doesn't turn people off to the general public in that aspect. And same thing with music. We're going to start to see Enlightenment ideas. Why do we keep playing for princes and kings and queens and princesses? We're going to see 2 composers in particular, Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who was exceptionally well-known Mozart. Haydn actually goes so far to call Mozart, when he speaks to his father, the greatest composer known to me. And what they share is this. Although they spend, say, Haydn in particular, most of his adult life as a musical director for a wealthy Hungarian princes, he's going to introduce music to other musicians through public concerts. And as a result of this, we're going to start to see these composers, these musicians, not just playing for the elites of society, but spreading the great works, great musical works, to the general public, for the public. This is very much an Enlightenment idea, as they're spreading something that was traditionally held and reserved for one sector of society because of superstition, because of arbitrary access to power, to now everybody else. Pretty fantastic stuff. All right, that's going to do it for us. when it comes to the Enlightenment, stay tuned for the next episode of Master's Class. I will see you.